This is the conventional or original design for the buccal canine retractor. It was introduced by Houston and Waters in 1970s. It consisted of anterior arm, coil, and posterior arm. It was mainly used for distal movement of mesially inclined canines. It has a non-traumatic coil or non-traumatic end or bend at its anterior arm, which will engage the mesial aspect of the canine need to be moved in a distal direction across the line of occlusion. However, the disadvantage of this design is that it's difficult to keep the anterior arm engaged on the mesial aspect of the canine during the whole range of action of this spring. So the more popular design is this one. This is the more popular design for the buccal canine retractor. The only difference between these two designs is that the end of the anterior arm has a C-shaped curve that is adapted to the labial aspect of the canine and extend from the middle of the tooth until the mesial contact area. So this design is more stable and offers control for both distal and palatal tooth movement. So this design can be activated to produce both distal movement of the canine as well as palatal movement. The buccal canine retractor has the following components: anterior arm, coil, posterior arm, occlusal part, and the retentive tag. The anterior arm should pass parallel to the long axis of the canine. This is very important to keep the forces perpendicular to the long axis of the tooth and thus prevent unwanted or uncontrolled tooth movement. The anterior arm extends till the middle of the height of the crown of the canine, where it ends in a C-shaped small arm that is well contoured and adapted to the labial surface of the canine and ends in the mesial contact area. It's important to keep this part or the C-shaped end well adapted to prevent trauma to the soft tissue and prevent food stagnation. Then there is a coil 3 to 5 mm in diameter, should be located 2 mm away from the depth of the vestibular sulcus. The position of the coil should be in the point that represents the midpoint between the present and future position of canine. So in case if we need to extract the first premolar and move or retract the canine distally into the space of the extracted first premolar, then this will be the correct position of the coil, which represents the point between the present and the future position of canine. This is the midpoint. Then there is the posterior arm, should be slightly curved. This is important to keep the forces horizontal and provide distal movement of the canine and prevent extrusive movements. The posterior arm will extend till the buccal embrasure between the first and second premolar. Then it will be bent in a palatal direction to form the occlusal part. The occlusal part should be kept above the mesial contact point of the second premolar. So even if you are working on a cast where the first premolar is extracted, you should keep the occlusal part above the mesial contact point of the second premolar in order not to interfere with the retraction of the canine into the space of the extracted first premolar. Then the wire ends palatally with a retentive arm or tag. It's important that you bend either a small hook at the end of the retentive tag, which should be also kept away from the palate, 0.5 to 1 millimeter, or you can end your retentive arm with a small L-shaped hook that is directed toward the palate. This hook is important to keep a space between the retentive arm and the palatal surface to provide enough room for the acrylic base plate. and provide better retention of the spring in the base plate, since the canine retractor tends to rotate in the acrylic base plate during its action. So the hook or the L-shaped bend are important to maintain good retention of the spring in acrylic. After construction of the spring, it should be completely passive. Should not exert any force on the cast on the tool, so it can be removed easily and it is loose on the cast. So the activation is effected for distal activation or distal movement of the canine. This is done by closing the coil by 1 millimeter only to prevent excessive forces, since it's constructed from 0.7 millimeter. While the distal palatal activation is effected at the anterior arm just as it emerges from the coil. This will be bent in a palatal direction to provide palatal movement of the canine, while closing the coil will provide distal movement of the canine. So the activation for distal retraction is done by closing the coil by 1 millimeter only, while the palatal activation is done in the anterior arm just as it emerges from the coil, bending it slightly toward the palate, and this will provide activation for palatal movement. During insertion of the activated spring, it may catch on the cuspal incline of the canine, so the patient should be instructed to move it with his or her fingertip into the correct position to perform its action. Good. Finally, you should check that your spring is contacting the cast at 3 points only: the point of force application, the occlusal part, and at the end of the retentive tag, just like the case here. All other areas, there should be clearance of about 0.5 to 1 millimeter between the spring and the buccal mucosa, as well as between the spring and the palatal mucosa.